The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm really, really honored to be here speaking with you. I think I, like other speakers, have way too many things I hope to tell you in the next 15 minutes. I welcome my participation on this South-to-South migration panel because, like other speakers, not concerned with migration to North America or Europe. That's what we share. But I think what's unusual about Gulf migration is that the receiving countries that many of the migrants I study are going to are, on a per capita basis, some of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest countries in the world. So there is that difference. And I also want to recognize, with the amazing cosmopolitan diversity of this audience, that there are certainly others in this room that likely know as much, if not more, about this migration than I do. But without further ado, we'll go here. So by some accountings, migration to the Arabian Peninsula is the third largest transnational movement of humans in the contemporary world, after Europe and North America as destinations. My understanding of this migration flow, and I've been studying this for 2 decades using ethnography, and my understanding is multi-sided. So I've spent quite a bit of time in the various Arab states to which migrants arrive. But as you can see from some of these pictures here, I've also spent quite a bit of time in the villages and cities in the sending countries as well, trying to understand both ends of these migration conduits that end in the Arabian Peninsula. So the geography of Gulf migration, this is an older slide of mine, but and there's nothing mathematical about this, but these are some of the predominant states in this Indian Ocean world that send migrants to the Arabian Peninsula. But one of the interesting things that I've discovered about this migration system is that every year when I'm back, there are suddenly these new populations of labor migrants that are present. So in 2010 and 11, for example, I encountered Vietnamese labor migrants in the labor camps for the first time. And lately we're seeing many more West Africans, and including some people from Central Asia as well. So this migration system is always sort of shifting and reaching out to these new sending states, as I try to diagram here with the green arrows. So the scale of Gulf migration also really merits discussion. And so here are some data, and I should note that data are very hard to come by when it comes to Arabia. These numbers are not always available, and while they're gathered by those states, they're not always released for public use. But these are some of the latest statistics that we have, and what it portrays, I think, is what many of us who study the region know, that in total, with these 6 GCC states, and that's Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, there's about 25 million labor migrants that reside and work in those places, which, interestingly, is about equal to the 26 million citizens that reside in the area. And I want to be perfectly clear here, unlike the migrations that we see in North America and Europe, there's no pathway for these migrants to citizenship or belonging in the states in which they work. These are vast, vast reservoirs of temporary labor that are present on the Arabian Peninsula. And that shapes, I think, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about in the remainder of my talk. I think one of the other really interesting and key characteristics about this migration system in Arabia is the kafala, or the sponsorship system, as we call it in English. And this sponsorship system, in short, means that every migrant is associated with his employer and can only arrive after he or she has obtained that employment. So they find their employment prior to arrival and are tied to that employer for the duration of their stay, which is typically organized in 2-year labor contracts. And so this is an unfree labor market. And I think that this really explains why any of you probably already have, or you could go find, plenty of articles that tell these horror stories about migrants in Arabia. But conversely, you can go and easily find migrants there whose families and fortunes were buoyed by their experience there. This variability has to do with the fact that so much is invested in the relationship between the employer and the sponsor. For one migrant who ends up with a perfectly fine sponsor employer, things are great. For the next migrant who ends up tied for 2 years to an exploitative employer, things are terrible for both him and the family that's behind him, perhaps in South Asia. And I'd also note that we're seeing the continued incremental erosion of this policy, and we're seeing things change for the better, I would argue, in many of the Gulf states for the labor migrants who arrive there, transnational labor migrants. I also want to talk briefly about the migration industry. I think it's fine to talk about what happens in Arabia, but all of these jobs, these 25 million migrants coming and going, that has really given rise to a migration industry, a transnational migration industry. And I've spent some time in Islamabad and Kathmandu and southern India sort of looking into this migration industry, which oftentimes in Nepal, for example, begins with a sub-agent, a dude who walks around to the villages and tries to persuade these young men that their future lies in Dubai. But that includes recruitment agencies in the urban hubs, a lot of related businesses, manpower agencies, training facilities, human resources personnel, and then there's all the stuff on the receiving end as well, the companies that employ them, the places that house them. And then, as William Walters, a political scientist, argued in his article about the deportation industry, he also said we need to think about the airlines and the airports and the buses that are involved in profiting oftentimes from this human mobility. And so thinking about this migration industry helps me sort of conceptualize and include all of these other stakeholders, many of whom are extracting a profit from these transnational movements of humans. And here, just for your information, you can see at one of the labor brokers in Kathmandu the kinds of sheets that they post outside. That's for 238 jobs, welders, plumbers, electricians, tile masons, and it says their pay and the number that are needed, just as an example. So here's another thing that I think is really unique and characteristic of the region, and that's the proportion of migrants to citizens in these Gulf states. So at one end, you have Saudi Arabia with about 63% citizens to 37% nationals. But at the other end, and I would say actually, according to my calculations, Qatar, we have bad data for Qatar here, although it's the only data available, is about 90, right? 90 to 10. So that's 9 foreign workers for every resident. And so, as those of you who've spent time in that part of the world know, it's really like these cities are like these seas of foreign workers, and unprecedented proportions and balances that we see there. Also, these migrant populations are extraordinarily diverse. My research team did the first ever vast survey of low-income labor migrants in Qatar, and we found 25 different nationalities just in our sample. So drawing from a wide array of sending nations. As an anthropologist, it was easy for me as an American, I suppose, with an interest in social justice, to think through the eyes and the experiences of these migrants. But it was after some time in Qatar and teaching at Qatar University that I really began to also think about the Qatari and the Arab experience in hosting such vast numbers of foreigners and what that means for the preservation of their society and their culture and their traditions as well. And I'll return a little bit to that point in this presentation. So in this portion of the second portion of my talk here, I want to talk a little bit about these migrants' experiences in the metropolises, or the cities of Arabia. And so transnational migrants, especially the lower class ones, live a very segregated life in the city. They're sifted and sorted in all kinds of different ways from the front stage of the city. They occupy these peripheral bachelor city and labor camp zones peripheral to the city, and even the shopping malls have family days that sort of sift and sort who's allowed in and who's not. And they're transported, as you saw in one of the previous slides, transported to and from their workplaces on these buses that carry them in and out of the city. So I was, years ago, sitting in my compound when I lived there. And this is my compound. I lived in one of those apartments, flats there. And I was writing some critical field notes about this process of segregation and thinking about what it means for all of these labor migrants who I study to be segregated to these particular portions of the city. I was in my compound with a bunch of other expats or professional level foreign workers like myself. But I mean, look at that picture. Here I am behind a wall with a bunch of other foreigners lamenting about the segregation of these other workers, when it didn't take long for me to sort of realize that, I mean, granted, my conditions are better and my positionality is stronger, but I also was segregated in the space of the city. Foreigners like myself in these designated zones within the city. And so, beginning to think about how this segregation in space in the city was really seemed like a defining element of the Arabian city to me. Well, that led me to this slide. So here, suddenly my mind started expanding with this notion. And you can see what you see if you go to a political or like a pornographic website, you get this censorship pops up in most places in Qatar, in Doha. But not all places. Some places have unfettered access to the internet. And then there's bars and alcohol, not available anywhere in Qatar except for a few designated places. And now with the World Cup coming, they're talking about drinking in fan zones. Again, having these designated spaces where this kind of activity can happen. We could say the same for gender mixed campuses, right? So there's Education City where there's all of these American and European universities that are gender mixed. But outside of those exceptional spaces in the city, you see gender-segregated campuses, including Qatar University, where I taught. And then this last picture on the lower right is the Pearl, an island that was reclaimed from the sea, which means they piled dirt in the ocean and built condominiums on it. But this is the only place where foreigners can buy property. So again, another exceptional space in the city. And so once I started thinking about urban space through this prism, it really helped me see that in my analysis, foreigners, including myself, including the low-income labor migrants, really fall into the same logic that I've described on this previous slide. That the city itself is becoming a tool for sort of sorting, organizing, and governing the Arab states' comprehensive and immersive embrace with the global, with so many foreigners and so many foreign practices there. This foreign matter, the way that they govern it is through urban space. And I, in my forthcoming book, talk at length about this. And also note that we should grasp how integration and assimilation, perhaps, sometimes I feel like they might be Western ethnocentricities that we think with, right? But those premises to our understanding of migration are not at all present in this migration system. And few of the workers I've interviewed over the many years have said they even desire to belong to this particular place. So my concluding thoughts, I'll wrap up quickly. First of all, I want to again assert that regional migration systems are very diverse and complex. and that while, of course, we are thinking with Europe and North America, the two primary migratory destinations, first and foremost, we need to pay attention to these other south to south or other migration systems as best we can, and to understand them for their diversity. As I've sort of hinted here at the end, I see the city itself in Arabia as one of the tools for governing those mobilities in the neoliberal century. And then as I was driving back through the mountains and on the Olympic Peninsula this weekend, I was thinking about Mecca, actually, a city that I'll never see. I would imagine some, if not many people in this room have seen it. But there's another kind of space of exclusion. I'm excluded from that space, but it's also a space of inclusion. It's a place where, a holy place, where including all Muslims. And so I guess one of the points that I'm continue to tussle with is this dyadic sort of relationship between inclusion and exclusion, and how sometimes these kinds of exclusions can be culturally valuable, for example, in maintaining sort of culture and tradition. And so that's the kind of spatial politics that I'm tussling with nowadays. And I thank you very much for your time and your attention.